August 26, 1942, Camp de Gurs, southwestern France. The summer heat pressed down on the Pyrenean foothills like a suffocating hand, but inside the barracks of Camp de Gurs, the air was thick with something worse than heat. It was the smell of despair. Hundreds of Jewish families sat in cramped wooden buildings, their faces hollow, their children too weak to cry. Outside, French gendarmes checked lists, counting names, preparing quotas. In 3 days, another train would arrive. Another 1,000 souls would be forced onto transport trains. None of them would ever return. A woman in a simple grey dress walked between the barracks, a leather satchel over her shoulder, her steps measured and calm. To the guards, she was just another social worker, a Protestant do-gooder from some charity organization, handing out blankets and writing letters for the illiterate. They waved her through without a second glance. They had no idea what was really in that satchel. They had no idea that this soft-spoken woman with the kind eyes had already smuggled 17 people out of this very camp. And tonight, she would do it again. Her name was Madeleine Barrot. She was 33 years old, and she was about to become one of the most dangerous women in Vichy France. What the guards didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that Barrot had built something extraordinary in the shadows. A network of forgers, safe houses, Protestant pastors, and ordinary families, willing to risk everything to hide strangers. By the time the war ended, this network would save hundreds of lives. But on that August evening, as she walked toward Barracks 7, with false documents hidden beneath a stack of prayer books, Madeleine Barrot had no idea if she would survive the night. She had not always been a rescuer. Years before the war, before the camps, before the lists and the trains and the terrified families, Madeleine Barrot had been an ordinary young woman from Châteauroux, a quiet town in central France. Born in 1909 to a Protestant family, she grew up in the tradition of French Huguenots, a minority faith that had known persecution for centuries. Her parents taught her that faith was not a Sunday performance but a daily practice. "What you believe," her mother once told her, "must be visible in what you do." She studied social work, drawn to the practical application of compassion. She was organized, meticulous, good with paperwork skills that seemed unremarkable at the time. Her professors noted her unusual combination of warmth and efficiency, her ability to navigate bureaucracies while never losing sight of the human beings those bureaucracies were meant to serve. She joined Protestant youth movements, attended ecumenical conferences, and developed a network of contacts across denominations that would later prove invaluable. In 1939, when war clouds gathered over Europe, she found her way to a small organization called CIMAID. The name was an acronym, Comité Intermouvements Auprès des Évacués, but what it meant in practice was simple: help those who had nowhere else to turn. When France fell in June 1940 and the country split into German-occupied North and Pétain's collaborationist South, CIMAID turned its attention to the internment camps that dotted Vichy France like open wounds. These camps had originally been built for Spanish Republican refugees fleeing Franco's victory. Now they held a new population: Jews, thousands of them. Families rounded up across Europe, crammed into barracks behind barbed wire, waiting for a fate they could not yet name. The Vichy government called them undesirables. The bureaucrats in Paris and Berlin had another name for what awaited them, but that name had not yet reached the world's ears. Madeleine Barrot entered the camps legally. CIMAID had negotiated access as a humanitarian organization. Social workers permitted to distribute aid, teach children, provide spiritual comfort. It was a fragile permission, dependent on appearing harmless. The authorities tolerated these Protestant women because they seemed useful for maintaining order. They handed out blankets. They wrote letters. They prayed with the dying. Surely, they posed no threat. But Barrot saw things in those camps that changed her forever. She saw children with distended bellies from malnutrition, their eyes too large in their shrunken faces. She saw elderly couples who had fled Germany years ago, believing France would protect them, now huddled on straw mattresses in unheated barracks. She saw mothers clutching infants, knowing that any day the gendarmes might come to separate them. And in the summer of 1942, she saw the trains. The first deportations from Vichy France began in August 1942. Jewish families were loaded into cattle cars at Gurs, at Rivesaltes, at Les Milles, camp after camp, feeding a pipeline that led to a transit camp called Drancy, and from there, eastward, to places whose names would later become synonymous with annihilation. Barrault watched the first trains leave. She heard the screaming. She saw children ripped from their mothers' arms, saw old men punished for moving too slowly, saw families who had survived everything, pogroms in Poland, Kristallnacht in Germany, the long flight across Europe finally broken by French gendarmes following German orders. That night, alone in her small room in the town of Oloron-Sainte-Marie, Madeleine Barrault made a decision that would define the rest of her life. Prayer was not enough. Comfort was not enough. Letters and blankets and hymns sung in barracks were not enough. If she truly believed that every human being was made in the image of God, then she could not stand by while those images were loaded onto trains and sent to camps from which few returned. She would have to break the law. She would have to lie, forge, smuggle, and deceive. She would have to become someone the authorities could not see, a shadow moving through the camps, extracting souls one by one from the machinery of murder. The risks were catastrophic. If caught, she would be arrested, deported, and likely never seen again. And worse, the entire CMAID network would be exposed, the camps closed to all aid workers, and thousands of Jews would lose their last thread of hope. Everything depended on remaining invisible. But Madeleine Barrault had one advantage the authorities had not anticipated. They underestimated her. She was a woman, a Protestant, a social worker with a gentle voice and impeccable paperwork. Who would suspect such a person of running an underground railroad? The system she built was elegant in its simplicity. CMAID workers would identify the most vulnerable prisoners, children, pregnant women, the elderly. Anyone whose deportation seemed imminent. Barrault and her team would then obtain false documents, fake identity cards, forged baptismal certificates, counterfeit travel permits. Some came from professional forgers in Marseille. Others were created by CMAID volunteers who had taught themselves the art of forgery by candlelight. With papers in hand, they would approach camp administrators with plausible stories. This child is actually Protestant. There's been a bureaucratic error. This woman's grandmother was Catholic. She doesn't belong here. This family has been cleared for emigration to Switzerland. Here are the transit documents. Sometimes the officials believed them. Sometimes they were bribed. Sometimes they simply didn't care enough to investigate. And sometimes, more often than Barrault liked to remember, they refused, and another family was loaded onto the trains. For those who made it out, the journey was only beginning. CMAID had established a network of safe houses across southern France, many of them run by Protestant families who understood the cost of sheltering fugitives. These were farmers and shopkeepers, teachers and pastors, ordinary people who opened their doors knowing that a single betrayal could mean death for their entire family. Some refugees were hidden in remote farms in the Cevennes Mountains, where the rugged terrain had sheltered religious dissenters for centuries. Others were guided to the village of Les Chambons-sur-Lignon, where Pastor André Trocmé had transformed an entire community into a sanctuary for the hunted. Still others were smuggled across the border into Switzerland or Spain, guided by couriers who knew the mountain paths by heart and could navigate them even in darkness, even in winter, even with children too exhausted to walk another step. Barrault coordinated all of it. She traveled constantly between camps, safe houses, and CMAID headquarters. Her leather satchel always heavy with documents that could have sentenced her to death. She slept in trains, in borrowed beds, sometimes not at all. She memorized names, routes, contact codes. She learned which guards could be bribed and which were true believers in Vichy's mission. She became, in the words of one survivor, a ghost who appeared when you had lost all hope. But for every life she saved, there were dozens she could not reach. The mathematics of genocide were overwhelming. Tens of thousands of Jews passed through Vichy's camps between 1942 and 1944. CMAID's network, for all its courage, could only extract a fraction, and every deportation train that left was a defeat, a reminder that mercy, however fierce, could not outrun systematic annihilation. The danger grew worse with each passing month. Vichy authorities, pressured by their German masters to increase deportation quotas, began tightening security around the camps. Guards were rotated more frequently to prevent corruption. Identity checks became more rigorous. Informers, some motivated by ideology, others by simple greed, began appearing in the refugee communities, reporting suspicious activity to the police. In the autumn of 1943, Barot's network suffered its first major blow. A safe house in Lyon was raided. 3 Sea-Maid volunteers were arrested. Under interrogation, one of them broke and revealed the names of 2 other operatives. The Gestapo, now openly operating in what had been the Free Zone, after Germany occupied all of France in November 1943, began hunting for the leadership of the Protestant Rescue Network. Barot received the warning just hours before police arrived at her last known address. She fled into the night, moving from one safe house to another, never staying more than 2 days in the same place. For weeks, she lived like the refugees she had been protecting, hunted, homeless, dependent on the courage of strangers. She continued coordinating rescues even while on the run, passing messages through trusted couriers, approving forged documents she would never see, guiding refugees along routes she could no longer walk herself. There were moments when faith seemed impossible to maintain. One night, hiding in a farmhouse cellar while German soldiers searched the property above, Barot found herself gripping the small cross she wore beneath her clothes, her lips moving in silent prayer. The cellar was cold and damp, smelling of earth and old wine barrels. She could hear the family who had sheltered her, a farmer, his wife, their teenage daughter answering questions upstairs, their voices carefully steady. If the soldiers found the hidden trapdoor, all of them would be arrested. All of them could be lost. She thought of the families she had not been able to save, the children whose faces she still saw in her dreams, the trains that kept running, night after night, carrying their human cargo eastward toward places from which no news ever returned. "Why do you permit this?" she whispered into the darkness. "Why do you not stop the trains?" No answer came, only the sound of boots on floorboards above her head, the muffled voices of soldiers, and then silence. They had moved on. She had survived another night. And in the morning, she would begin again. Because that was the answer, she realized. Not a voice from heaven, not a miracle that stopped the machinery of death. The answer was her. The answer was every person who chose to hide a stranger, forge a document, guide a refugee across a mountain pass. The answer was the stubborn, exhausting, dangerous work of mercy, one life at a time, one night at a time, until the darkness finally lifted. The final months of the occupation were the most perilous. With Allied forces advancing after D-Day, the Nazis and their French collaborators became increasingly desperate and increasingly brutal. Deportations accelerated, reprisals against resistors intensified. The militia, Vichy's paramilitary police, roamed the countryside hunting Jews and their protectors with fanatical zeal. Barot and her team worked faster than ever, knowing that every day could be the last for those still trapped in camps. They forged documents in record time. They bribed guards with money they didn't have. They took risks that would have seemed insane a year earlier, walking into camps in broad daylight, brazenly claiming prisoners as their own, counting on chaos and German desperation to cover their tracks. In one of the final operations before liberation, Barot personally escorted a group of Jewish children out of Rivesalti's camp, using documents so crudely forged that she was certain they would be caught. The ink was still slightly wet. The stamps didn't quite match the official ones. But there was no time to do better. A deportation train was scheduled for the following morning, and these 7 children would be on it unless she acted now. The guard at the gate studied the papers for what felt like hours. Barot stood perfectly still, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. The children, 7 of them, the oldest barely 10, the youngest only 4, clung to her skirt, too terrified to speak. She could feel their small fingers gripping the fabric, their bodies trembling against her legs. Finally, the guard shrugged and waved them through. He was tired. The war was almost over. What difference did 7 children make? Barot walked those children 3 kilometers to a waiting truck, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stand. She watched the truck disappear down the road toward a safe house in the mountains. Then she sat down on a stone wall beside the road and wept. August 1944. The Allies swept across France. Paris was liberated on the 25th. Camp after camp was opened. Thousands of refugees emerged from hiding from attics and cellars, from convents and farmhouses, from the mountain villages where Protestant families had sheltered them for years. Many searched desperately for family members who had been deported. Most would never find them. Madeleine Barrault did not attend the victory celebrations. She was already working on the next crisis, the thousands of displaced persons who needed housing, food, documents, help rebuilding lives shattered by 4 years of occupation. For her, the war had never been about defeating an enemy. It had been about protecting the vulnerable, and there were always more vulnerable people who needed protection. In the years that followed, Barrault continued the work she had begun in the camps. She joined the World Council of Churches, dedicating herself to refugee advocacy on an international scale. She helped build the modern framework of ecumenical cooperation, Protestants, Catholics, Orthodox, all working together in the service of human dignity. She traveled across continents, speaking to audiences who needed to understand what had happened and what must never be allowed to happen again. She organized relief efforts for displaced persons in post-war Europe. She advocated for stronger international protections for refugees. She wrote articles and gave interviews, always deflecting attention from herself toward the larger cause. She never stopped. CIMAID survived the war and exists to this day, still advocating for refugees in France and beyond. It is, in many ways, Madeleine Barrault's living legacy, a testament to what a small group of determined people can accomplish when they refuse to accept that evil is inevitable. Barrault herself received the recognition she never sought. In 1988, Yad Vashem, Israel's official memorial to the Holocaust, named her Righteous Among the Nations, honoring non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the genocide. A tree was planted in her name in the Garden of the Righteous in Jerusalem. She accepted the honor quietly, as she had done everything else. She died in 1995, at the age of 86. In her final years, when asked about her wartime activities, she would often deflect praise to others, to the families who had hidden refugees, to the forgers who had risked their lives, to the pastors and priests and ordinary citizens who had formed the network that made rescue possible. "I was only one person," she would say. "We were many." But survivors remembered her differently. They remembered the woman who had appeared in the camps like an angel, who had spoken to them in a calm voice when all was chaos, who had handed them documents and told them exactly where to go and what to say. They remembered the moment when hope returned, the moment when they realized that not everyone had abandoned them, that somewhere in the darkness there were still people who believed their lives had value. One survivor, interviewed decades after the war, struggled to describe what Barrault had meant to him. He had been 7 years old when she led him out of Gurs. He remembered her grey dress. He remembered her kind eyes. He remembered the feel of her hand holding his as they walked past the guards. "She was not loud," he said finally. "She did not make speeches. She simply did what had to be done, again and again, until we were free." I think that is what courage really looks like. Not a single moment of heroism, but 1,000 small choices, every day, for years. She chose us. She kept choosing us. And because of that, I am alive. The trains no longer run to the camps. The barbed wire has rusted away. The barracks have been torn down or turned into memorials. But the question Madeleine Barrault answered with her life remains as urgent as ever. When the machinery of cruelty begins to move, when the lists are drawn up and the quotas are set and the trains are loaded, what will you do? She did not wait for someone else to act. She did not tell herself that one person could not make a difference. She walked into the camps with her leather satchel and her forged documents and her quiet, unshakable faith. And she began one life at a time to prove the architects of cruelty wrong. Some lights refuse to be extinguished. Some shadows shelter the hunted. And some ordinary women, armed with nothing but paperwork and prayer, become more powerful than all the armies of darkness. Madeleine Barrault was one of them.